Well, wood prices are up, of all things. I just think the memes about it are so freaking funny. Well, it's July now, and by the time you're watching this, the price of wood will probably have gone back down to something a little bit more normal. I mean, we'll see. But what if I wanted to make a little bit of money off of that prediction? Well, I probably couldn't, at least not super directly. But the way that I would is actually a really good mirror for how stock shorting works on the stock market. I spent a long time being confused on how all that works, and it wasn't until I heard a super concrete analogy like this that I actually understood it. So I'll explain it to you. As a disclaimer, this is a totally hypothetical scenario, and it deals with some transactions that would probably never happen in the real world. But at the end, I'll show you how it ties back into how the real-life stock market really does work. My hypothetical scenario starts with me going to a sawmill and making a really weird deal with them. I go, hey, can I rent 10 sheets of plywood from you? I'll pay you interest. And they look at me and they're like, well, that's kind of a weird deal, but you know, times are tight and we could use a little bit of extra money, so sure, rent 10 sheets of plywood from us. We don't care. So I take my 10 sheets of plywood and I turn around and I sell them at Home Depot. Right now at Home Depot, plywood is going for $69 a sheet. Nice. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna round that price up to $70 and I'm gonna pretend like Home Depot doesn't take a cut. Again, hypothetical scenario, I can do what I want. Now, let's stop here and look at the situation I'm in. I've got $700 in my pocket, I'm paying a little bit of interest to the sawmill, and I owe them 10 sheets of plywood, not $700. And that's a really important distinction because if my prediction comes true and after a little while the price of wood does go down to something a little bit more reasonable, like $20 a sheet, it's pretty cheap for me to go back to Home Depot, buy 10 pieces of plywood, and pay back the sawmill. Now, minus the interest I paid, all the money I saved in that whole process is mine to keep. And that is how a stock short works. Except in the real world, we're talking about stocks, not sheets of plywood. We're talking about the stock market, not Home Depot. And instead of talking about a sawmill, we're talking about investment accounts that are hanging on to a handful of stocks, specifically one of the stocks you wanted to short. So let's walk through the scenario again, except this time we'll use the real life counterparts to my analogy. And by the way, we're gonna be talking about a stockbroker this time, not an average Joe like me. So once the stockbroker has picked a stock that he thinks will go down in value, he approaches an account that's hanging on to that stock and pays them a little bit of interest so that he can borrow a couple of shares. Then he turns around and sells those shares on the stock market. Let's say that at the time he sold them, the shares were going for $70 a piece, so he gets $700 in his pocket. If we stop and look at the situation the broker is in, he's got $700 in assets and 10 shares in the stock that he borrowed in liabilities, not $700 in liabilities. So if his prediction turns out to be accurate and the price of the stock in question drops to about $20 a share, it's pretty cheap for him to go to the stock market, buy 10 shares of that stock, and return it to the investment account. And then all the money he saved in the process is his to keep. Now, if we look at this sequence of events on a timeline, we can see something pretty cool. After the broker borrowed the shares from the investment account, he sold the shares on the market. Then later, he bought those shares back off the market in order to give them back to the investment account. Now, if we turn this timeline into a graph that includes the price of the shares at the time he bought and sold them, we can see something super interesting. The broker sold the shares when their price was high and bought the shares when their price was low. You know, the most basic investment principle is buy low, sell high. And with this successful stock short, we can see that shorting is rooted in the idea of selling high and buying low. It's still buy low, sell high, just done in the reverse order. Now, hopefully my analogy helped you understand how all this works. Of course, it's not a perfect analogy because maybe a sawmill would have a different quality standard than Home Depot. Plus, what would you be doing renting wood anyway? That would never happen and is super weird.